Where are you going? Questions responded to by Ajahn Sucitto and Nick Scott. Thank you for all the questions that you have submitted. We've chosen a representative selection which I'll now be putting before Ajahn and Nick, who are here with me on Zoom. Several questions were submitted on how you wrote the books, including these two. The books work well coming from the 2 points of view. Whose idea was that, and how did it develop? That was from Paul of Galway in Ireland. And from Rose of Boston, USA, I'm curious as to how you managed to tell the story going back and forth between the two of you. It seems so seamless. Did you show each other what you were writing as you were compiling the story? Did you pick certain days or topics to write about? How did it all come together? Ajahn, could you respond to that?
I can respond to it, yeah. This pilgrimage was a sort of a constant ad lib, with certain ideas and plans and constantly changing and flowing along with it. And I brought along a little book with me just to write notes in, so I'd be able to give a record of what we did. But the diary got stolen, the book got stolen, so I just still kept some notes. And somewhere I think we're in Nepal. And we were thinking, well, maybe it'd be good just to, write this up properly. That was just stayed there cooking away in the background. That was after about 4 months of walking. So I had all these notes in this little red diary that Nick had bought in Calcutta. And then we were just thinking about it. And I think the assumption was I'd write this book because I do quite a bit of writing. But then I don't exactly, we talk a lot. So we're just kicking it around. It felt like, there's some things I can't say really because Nick was in on it. It's his point of view. All kinds of stuff. It was particularly how he saw me and what he was going through and his view of it. That's very much part of the pilgrimage. And also the fact that you get the idea of two people in rather different minds operating the same scenario. That's part of what the pilgrimage is about. It's not just about walking on the ground. It's about digging down through your mind. And one of the big things you've got to do when you dig down through your mind is work out a relationship with other people and get to look at yourself and your attitudes. So in a way, that's part of what the pilgrimage is about, presenting those two attitudes together. So it's very important the two of us wrote something. Wouldn't you say so, Nick?
What I remember is you writing the first 2 chapters and me reading them and thinking, this isn't my pilgrimage. You were effusive about the difficulties. You know how you can be uplifted by difficulty. I was reading it, thinking, this is the worst thing I did in my life. Especially that beginning, the opening chapter second chapter as we're walking, because, God, so then I said that to you, and you said, you kind of, you listened in the way you do, you thought about it. You said, well, if you'd like to make some notes, Nick, I'll express what you were feeling, So then you had another go at it, doing that, and that didn't work, And we thought, well, I'll have a go at writing it. But of course, the problem was I couldn't write. I still remember a car ride, driving in a car, and asking you what you thought of what I'd written. And you were finally able to, looking out of the car window and not looking at me, you were able to let me have it full on just how bad it was. You said, there's no description, there's no this. It's atrocious. Once we decided to write it, Ajahn helped me taught me how to write. That's how we ended up like that. He would go through my stuff and say, yes, Nick, but what were they wearing? Yes, but what were you feeling? And that's how I ended up like that.
Yeah, and there are more adjectives than good and enjoyable in the English language.
There's very good and very enjoyable. You were always getting rid of my verys.
Yeah, so then at that time we were then both living at Chithurst Monastery. This book took 11 years to write. Okay? So it wasn't like we sat down on a writing project. Nick was here to help out with maintenance in the monastery, and I was the abbot. So we were there together, and then when we had some spare time, one of us would just sit down and write something, you know. And so I think most of them started off as I'd write a section, and then, you know, and then so I don't know exactly how we did that, but I'd write a section, and then Nick would write something, and they'd sort of seem to fit. He'd pick it up where I went off, and often I think some of his stuff would be almost like an alternative view of what I just said, almost like two musicians riffing off each other. You know, I'm playing this and he's playing that. So that's how it worked out. This was 11 years.
Yeah, I remember. I think I was doing some of the edits for you of those chapters, and I remember the first few chapters. It was all red ink everywhere, and then after a while, you know, there's hardly any. You know, it got less and less.
Yeah, because eventually we got into a bit of a flow with it, but it was a slow process getting it off the ground because we didn't really have a clear idea. I had a kind of literary structure in my mind, which was there should be 28 chapters because there are 28 Buddhas, and each chapter should begin and end in the same note. So you see, the first chapter begins with the sound of the bat, and it ends with the sound of the guy snoring. So every chapter begins and ends with the same note. That was the frame, and then we just, you know, put stuff in there that would fit. And yeah, it seemed to. So after a while, it got into a bit of a flow. And then sometimes Nick would be ahead of me because I'd be too busy doing stuff, and I'd catch him up. And so it just worked out. And then we'd look at what we'd written because it was a slow process. And looking at what we'd written and talking about it, when we got time, we'd start to develop a bit of a process of editing and saying what we felt about the other person's work, you know, how it came across and what bits were missing. And that would give me an idea, perhaps, of the next thing I wanted to say. Would lead on from that.
I'd say that we contributed to, you know, obviously Ajahn is a better writer. So I tried to complement that deliberately by writing simply. You know, Ajahn writing is so dense. I would deliberately try and write simple stuff and not try and do that at all, so that people would get a break, you know, and then they go back to something more interesting and dense, and then they have a little bit of, you know, I was hot, you know, walking along stuff. But there's two things I think are really important. One is that we're both people who can be really honest about ourselves, and we don't mind being totally honest about ourselves and someone saying something about us if it's honest. You know, we don't have any sense of privacy around that kind of stuff, and that the fact that we're both like that made it possible, the book to be possible. I mean, sometimes Ajahn would say, I'm not like that. You know, we'd have a debate over whether he was or he wasn't. You know, but, you know, as long as it was true, we could say it. And the fact that we were both writing meant we could both be honest about each other. You know, if one of us was writing it, it's really unfair. You know. But if we're both writing it, you can be totally honest about the other person because the other person's going to do the same. And then the other point I'd make that I realised worked well is, as you heard, Ajahn is very good at structure and themes and everything like that about a chapter, which I didn't think about at all until right at the end when I started some of the chapters. But mostly Ajahn would do that. But I'm a storyteller, so I had a sense of the overall arc of the story. So quite often I would say to Ajahn, no, don't tell them that now. We'll save that for later, and we need to tell them this now in this chapter because later on they'll find that out. You know, so I think about the arc of the story.
Excellent. And then when it came to recording the book for the podcast, there's a couple of representative questions. One's from Barry in Glasgow. In hindsight, would you think again about doing the mock Indian accents for the podcast? it felt out of touch rather than offensive, but some might see it differently. And Noel in Coventry wrote, "You both read the book well. I particularly enjoyed some of Ajahn Sucitto's readings. It all sounded relaxed and natural. How easy did you find that to do?" Nick, perhaps you could talk about that to start with.
Yeah, I can talk about the cod accents because I've got a lot of experience about this, because I've started recording the Kailash, the book of Walking to Mount Kailash, where I do a lot of conversation. I quote people a lot, and I was horrified that I'd have to do accents because I'm not great at it, as is obvious with this book. But I discovered that you can't do it any other way. If you just do it in your ordinary voice, people are confused who they're listening to. They don't get all the clues that they get when they're reading dialogue. And if you just do it in a standard voice for someone else, it doesn't work. So you have to do your best to do cod accents. No, I have no regret about doing the cod accents. I have regret that I'm not better at it. But that's, I did as good as I could. Ajahn, you got any comments?
Well, yeah, I was quite concerned, particularly the Indian, because, its sensitivity to colonialism, British colonialism, looking down on Indians, and this kind of comic Peter Sellers Indian thing, so that was sitting in my mind as a background sensitivities. But so actually what we did was he contacted an Indian monk who was in one of our monasteries and said, "We'll record this and we'll give you the recording. Please let us know if it sounds offensive or anything wrong with it, because we want this to, we don't want to be upsetting people unconsciously or consciously." So he listened to every one of our recordings. He never commented on the accents. He said, "Oh, you can make it a bit more fruity if you like." So he actually said you could actually ramp it up a bit if you wanted to. So that was very reassuring, actually.
He did comment, because that was my surprise, that he complimented us on our accents. That was it. He never ever asked. And it's not like he was just complimentary about everything. He'd get us to change the text, wouldn't he? Because it was offensive.
Some of our understanding of Hindu religion wasn't quite on, or some of the Upanishadic things weren't, and he pointed out. So he wasn't just being, timid, but he had no problem with the accents, which was a great relief.
Also, I think listeners might be interested to hear your stories of actually recording the podcast during lockdown. I remember you talking about having a microphone strapped to your head at one point.
Yes, relaxed and natural. That makes me laugh. Yeah, because it was extraordinary. Because I only had this very simple, I didn't have a proper mic. I had a little dictaphone. And if I had it in front of my mouth, you get the sound of the breath. And so the sound engineer was saying, "No, it's too soft, there's too much breath on it." So the only way I could get it near my head was to put a rubber band around my head and strap it upside down to my temple. So it was beside my head, very close to my voice, but my breath wasn't hitting it. And so even then, you'd sit there and I'd creak my chair, and, so he said, "Don't move, because if you creak your chair, that sounds. If you tap your fingers on the table, that sounds. So don't move." Don't move, and be careful with your breathing. So, so it took a while to get used to that kind of being that strapped in. And I think it was fundamentally, I think the first chapter went rather well, because I was and then the second chapter, it wasn't so well. And Nick commented, "This doesn't sound very lively anymore." And I realised the problem was I was very holding it all very tight to try and get it right. But I was reading the book the way you read a book. When you read a book, you don't. And I had to actually not read the book, but speak the book like an actor. And once I got into that, being a bit more dramatic and voluble, then it came across rather well, I think. I was pleased with it by the end. Even though the recording quality wasn't great, the voices, I think, were good. Mm-hmm.
I agree with the questioner that some of Ajahn Sucitto's readings were excellent. especially the beginning, the first one. Me and Mish, because we had one go at it where it didn't work, and then we did it again, and Ajahn really kind of let rip, and me and Mish were stunned by the reading, and it took me a long time before I could read well. So for about the first 5 or 6 chapters, I'm still disappointed by the quality of them. But because in those early chapters, Ajahn is doing more of the writing, because I had he'd already written some of those, so I didn't do a lot of writing in those. It didn't matter that my reading wasn't so good.
Then there's a question for Ajahn from Mike from Perth in Australia. How much did writing about the experience help you with digesting and learning from it? What was the effect of reading it for the podcast all these years later?
Yeah. Well, yes, certainly writing did help. It was a very powerful experience, and I don't think you can really take it all in when you're doing it, because when you're actually on the pilgrimage, so much of your system is just trying to get through the day, just trying to hang in and get through the day with the various afflictions that discomfort. You can't really reflect upon it, you just endure it. So it's only afterwards that you could probably sit down and turn it over. So writing actually was quite important to complete the process. It allowed that room for reflection, because on the pilgrimage there was no room for reflection. You were so in it, and then when you reflected upon it, was able to notice, and consider the effects, and also see it in perspective, which really helped to see it in perspective. And also similarly with the podcast, it was great getting back to it after 30 years. I think it's the only one of the books I've ever read.
You've also said it's the only book of yours you haven't wanted to rewrite.
Right, I actually found it very funny and touching, and so it was very enjoyable revisiting it, just because I could see this, with the view of hindsight, and now safely, cushioned in my comfortable place in England. I can look back with a sense of humour and warmth when those qualities were not always present at the time.
There's another question about the hardships involved from two people, both Graham from Cornwall and Nia from Manchester, questioned the amount of hardship you undertook. And Nia put it this way: there was much hardship for you both, and deliberately undertaken. How does this connect with the Buddha's abandoning of austerities and the practice and teaching of the middle way?
Yeah, well, it's a pilgrimage, and the phrase in our tradition is Dutanga, and we're a Dutanga tradition. Dutanga means sort of austere or shaking off. That's definitely a kind of an attitude and a practice we undertake. It's testing yourself. And so when you go on pilgrimage, it's not a walkabout, it's not a tour, it's not sightseeing. It's actually taking yourself to some edges and some limits and pushing against your comfort zones. That's what the practice is about on that level. Now, it's the Buddha's middle way was really midway between deliberate mortification, such as refusing to eat, or standing on one leg, or growing your fingernails long, or not cutting it. I mean, really deliberate punishment of the body. We didn't actually seek to deliberately punish our bodies. We sought to try and keep ourselves alive. That was our attitude. It was not, let's make it worse, but actually put yourself in a testing situation. It was not asceticism. So the Buddha was against asceticism, but not austerity. If you look at the way the Buddha lived, for most of us, that would not be the middle way. That would be considered an extreme. But actually, that's what he considered the middle. The middle is moved. And for a samana, you're a renunciant. for a summoner, you are someone who's renounced. It means you've given up the security of home, comfort, guaranteed food. That's the standard for a summoner. And if you go on pilgrimage, then in some ways you try to live up to that standard and test yourself, patience, resilience, and looking at what it brings up in your mind. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I'll just say something about that. That I was contemplating it as Ajahn was answering, because I've done several pilgrimages. I've done one with you, Sam, when we walked across Connemara to Croagh and then out to Caher Island. And however you set them up, they always end up being difficult. That what we do.
They do.
But it is definitely part of it. It's the overcoming of difficulty and working with difficulty. The two big walks I've done, the two big pilgrimages I've done, which is this one, and the one to Mount Kailash, were, I think, the most powerful things I've done in my spiritual practice. They're both things that really, there was a real change that came about through them. So. And part of that was the difficulty. Anyway, you want to move on to another question?
Well, not really. It's the same theme in a sense, to do with austerity, but it's a question from Marion from Scotland, and she said, as two privileged Western white men, do you still feel it was necessary to adopt such an impoverished lifestyle in a country where the vast majority live that life for real?
Well, it's good I answer this, because what the questioner has to take into account is that Ajahn is bhikkhu means beggar, so he's not adopting a lifestyle. So for him, so it's really only me to answer this. Ajahn was just being a bhikkhu, which is what he will be anywhere. This is something that me and my partner Michelin think about a lot, because we travel quite often to third world places and places where not many foreigners go, and it's a very delicate thing when you're doing that to not upset that culture with being rich, with having lots of money, but then somehow on the journey being of benefit when you can, in a not upsetting way. So first of all, I don't think on this pilgrimage we actually, I deliberately gave away the savings I had before I started. I didn't own anything. I didn't own a house or a car or anything. So I gave away the savings I had to a charity, so that I did go poor, and Ajahn was poor, because I felt that was appropriate. Normally, when travelling, I wouldn't do that, but I'd still try and live in the way of the people I'm passing through, because when you do that, the natural friendliness and kindness of that culture manifests. And if you've got too much money, you kind of destroy that. They instead see travellers as something to get something from. But you can pass through a society and give little gifts when you stay with people. On this pilgrimage, the only thing we had was those photographs of ourselves, but people like those. Normally I take things I could give to people, and then occasionally you find a situation where you can make a real donation to something and send some money afterwards. So I don't think what we did was wrong at all. I think that's the right way to travel in a third world country at the level of the people you're passing through.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to add to that, Ajahn?
Yeah, absolutely. It's as I say, a pilgrimage it's not a tour. It's not a walkabout. It's an immersion. You immerse yourself. You dip in. You don't just walk. You don't walk on the surface. You descend into, immerse yourself in the culture, the land, the people that you're with. And for most of that time, I was walking through rural Bihar. We immersed ourselves. We went to their level, because that's the way you feel you're integrating. You're definitely taking on that whole ecosphere, the psychologies, the attitudes, the land, the need for survival, rather than just getting in the tour bus, where you just skim across the surface. You really get your feet into it, and so it's necessary to be at that sort of standard. That's appropriate. You're not a sightseer. You want to be part of the people, because they're the people who will be feeding you. How could you walk through a country of poor people with a whole bunch of money in your pocket, expecting them to feed you? You couldn't, could you? And yet the point is to go on a pilgrimage as a Buddhist monk, in that way of living on faith. Live on faith. That's the idea of the pilgrimage, to live on faith. This means you don't have all kinds of fallbacks. So this means you've got to live dependent or in relationship with the people around you. Well, therefore you've got to be someone who can be supported. If you don't need to be supported, the faith thing disappears. You're in security, not in faith. You've got a need. You've got to be in need. Otherwise there's no faith. There's no gamble. There's no risk. That's the principle of bhikkhu life,
And it allows those beautiful interactions to happen with people.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we would be so grateful.
And then once they recognise, hey, these white guys, are actually, they're just walking across the land. They got no home. They got no food. Oh, and then it's not we're asking for anything. And often the offerings were modest, but it was a genuine meeting of heart. It was made possible by the fact that we were at their level rather than above them.
Yes, and yet, there's also several questions about the robbery that occurred. One example of the question was from Bridie in Galway of Ireland. She said, "I was profoundly moved by the story of the robbery and how you both dealt with this. I wonder how you now view your actions and what lessons you might have drawn from them with time."
For me, as I say, I think both of us, right at the beginning, I think Nick said, this is a bit risky what we're doing. I've given my money away, I've written out my will. That's the keynote. I've written my will. It's a bit risky. In other words, you might not survive. Bear it in mind. And that's a good keynote for a pilgrimage. That's very good for a pilgrimage. That's a good keynote. You are here to put your life on the line, right? And that takes you to a pretty deep place in yourself, which is the whole point of pilgrimage. It's not a walking holiday. It's to go to a pretty deep place in yourself where there's a lot of insecurity, a lot of risk, and you just have to meet what happens to your mind at that place. So with this robbery thing, it's been a very, as the chapter proceeds, it's been a really rather dark time in Rajgir, and we were not getting support, and it was a bit risky, and then we had these talk about robbers and all that, and I thought, you just deal with it. This is what's coming, you just deal with it. If this is what it's supposed to be, you deal with it, you live with it. And then when that occasion came, there's a sense of, this is the time. Okay. And something in you, when you live close to the edge of that might not survive, there's a particular mode the mind goes into near death. If you've had any near-death experiences, I've had a few, your mind goes into a particular place which was really quiet, there's a certain depth to it, and you just say, okay, give up. That's it. And I thought, I recognise that place. That was that place again. I've been there a few times. It's okay, give up. That's it. And just open. And it does that. And so that's kind of what happened, that particular situation. So, my actions were almost inevitable, really. As I said at the time, you've got 5 guys with axes. What's the chances?
Yes.
Yes, sir, is the first word you come to mind. But they weren't having that. I was trying to say, look, you can have my stuff. So but they didn't quite understand what was going on. So you think, oh well. And so the inevitable wasn't my action, really. My action was to try to give my stuff away. The rest of it was just almost inevitable. The attacker's action just immediately caused that reflection to occur from my mind at that moment of death. You know, I was pretty much, okay, this is the moment of death. My mind went into that place of, okay, surrender. So then the body just kind of made that bow, okay, here we go, you know. It was not exactly a personal action. It was an action that came from that depth of meeting death. What lessons you might have drawn from them with time? Well, I think there's a certain confidence in the mind. I don't live at that place of near death most of the time. So most of the time I'm living in the top story of my mind, you know, bumbling around this and that, what's happening tomorrow, and why is this going on, yada, 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 you know. And so sometimes you lose touch with what's there, really, almost in the core of the mind. When you put away all this bumble and waffle that's going on in your head, you get down to, you think, yeah, there's that is ready to just surrender. And I found that very encouraging. And you don't want to forget it, because it's essentially, death is the most normal, natural, inevitable thing. You should live with death all the time. It helps to keep your life in order from being arrogant, greedy, possessive, you know, caught up with grievances and grudges. You just use death as a house cleaner, so you're ready to go, because you will go.
Did you want to add anything, Nick, to that?
Yeah. Well, obviously, because we both responded, but our stories of what happened for us there were so different. It's to follow on the way Ajahn is answering it. What it reminds me of is being there for my mother's death and my father's death. For my mother's death, I arrived at a hospital, you know, some time before she died, and I was able to be there for that process and be there right in the moment. It was a very, very uplifting thing to be able to do. For my father, I was the principal carer, and by then I'd been living there for 4 months, and I was in carer mode. And when my father died, I was on the phone to the doctor trying to work out what I could do to help him, because I was the carer, you know. And luckily, I had a friend visiting who had been with people dying before, and she sat with him when he died. And I feel the same about what happened about the robbery. When I went to Mount Kailash, I was facing death on my own, not responsible for anyone, and my attitude to it was much more like what Ajahn is just talking about. But in the Indian pilgrimage, I felt responsible. I felt responsible for both of us. So I'd always felt, what am I going to do if this happens? How am I going to save our passports? How am I going to save the money? I'd had to think like that, because it was my role,
Yeah.
So that kicked in, like, phoning the doctor when my father was actually dying to say, what do I, he looks really unwell at the moment. I always had the idea that I'd try and escape and hide the money and the passports. It's interesting as I reflect afterwards in the book, actually they weren't the most important things, but for some reason you think they are. So when you're planning it, you don't think in terms of the film from the camera and Ajahns notebooks, which were actually the most important things. So, looking back now in a more reflective way about it, that's what I see that happened. It was karmic. The way I responded was karmic. It came out of the role I was playing. and I didn't get the opportunity, to deal with it in the way that Ajahn did. And and as I express in the book, I'm just so glad that I didn't die then, because I would have died with the mind of as what I express, the mind of a hounded water buffalo. So yes, I've thought about that more, and looking back on it, and that's how I feel about it.
Thank you. Then there was also a question about the relationship, because obviously it was a very intensive relationship between the two of you during the pilgrimage. And there was a question from Jane from Stansted in Essex, asked you to comment on the value of being in a relationship for Dharma practice as opposed to living and travelling alone. And perhaps, Nick, you could talk about that.
Okay, yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, the book itself is a demonstration of how useful it was to be in a relationship to do that pilgrimage. It was essential. If you were doing it on your own, it wouldn't have been the same. The added dimensions of doing it with someone else was really important. And I think relationship is important in Dharma practice. And I'm a lay person, and I spent 10 years at Chithurst Monastery with kind of 1 foot in a kind of monastic situation and 1 foot out, and I really get an appreciation of what, how monasticism is about relationship. I mean, they're all in this large family together, and it's a very important part of their practice. And as a lay person, I see its relationship outside is important for the same reason, that we're designed to be in relationships as human beings. And I just think it's much more difficult for us as lay people, because we're then in a relationship, that has a load of programming around it about reproduction and how a male and female interact and all of that, there's loads of expectation out of that, and that the other person is going to supply this for me, and that person might think I've got to supply things for them, and expectation, and that's what's so lovely in a monastic family situation. There isn't this expectation of what they're going to supply with each other to support each other. There's not the same kind of. They are very supportive and very kind and all that. The relationship stuff is all there, but without the same extra thing that we get in lay life. So I think relationship's important. I think it was a very important part of the pilgrimage, and it's. We've got to. It helps us learn. I think as a layperson, I teach now, and I always give this advice to people. I think being a layperson and trying to live on your own is a very lonely way of living. Because when you're in a relationship, you have someone to love. Yeah, you could have a cat. It's not as good. Anyway, Ajahn, would you like to comment on it?
Well, I would agree with everything that Nick has said, really. It's important to love, and to know love isn't romantic. It's about being spacious and allowing and supportive. It's not romantic. It's not sweet, but it's absolutely necessary and fundamental to human beings. If we don't love in that way, then something in us hasn't properly grown. I think love is a very, very sullied term for the qualities of heart that are possible, and between people, spaciousness, giving, generosity, patience, compassion, affection, and all that. And that's certainly, I think part of the pilgrimage, because so monastic life, you are together, but you're not together 24 hours a day. Through thick and thin till death us do part. So, and you're not, with each other in duress, and the other person's getting sick, and you've got a headache, and you don't feel very well, and you don't agree, well, there's nowhere to walk off to. You've got to stick together. You can't just turn on your heel and go somewhere else. So it's something you have to keep giving. And to me, one of the key features of it is that we're both willful people. I'm sure everybody is willful, but you don't get to be what I'm doing or what Nick's doing if you don't have any willpower. Some sense of personal push and willpower, and then that wing's got to soften, because you're not going to get it going the way you want it to if you're with somebody else who also has willpower. You're going to either fight and struggle, or you've got to start to cooperate, and that softening and mellowing of the will is very, very, that's another thing that you can only really do with other people. He'll come back to you. He'll meet you at that place, and it doesn't have to be aggressive, but certainly you're going to have to work it out. And your own will has to accommodate somebody else, and that's all part of the richness of life, whereby you somehow you get a little bit of the treasure of the other person's life. That's the way he enjoys things. I never thought of that. He likes looking at birds. Well, look at you get a bit of happiness to see the man's happy looking at these birds flying around in the sky. Like, big deal. But he's happy. And you think, so that you kind of, isn't that wonderful? So you start looking at yourself. That's kind of cute, and so on and so on and so on. So we enrich each other as well. That's part of it. It was tough, but it was also very enriching, and a lot of warm-heartedness. It was tough places, but fundamentally, you're in it together, and you're going to do whatever you can to make sure the other guy's okay.
I think Ajahn right. It's the heart, it gives the opportunity for the heart to be in the experience, being with someone else. And I was just reflecting as you were speaking, if you were to do a pilgrimage on your own, it would be like travelling on your own, where you can just move on when it all gets too much, or duck out of something. It wouldn't have been half as an intense an experience or rewarding experience if you were doing it on your own.
Well, there's a question. In fact, many people asked you to comment on how the pilgrimage has affected you, such as Gary from Edinburgh, who asked, overall, the journey seems to have been transformational for you both. Is this the case? And if so, what have been the long-term changes and effects in your lives? Ajahn, perhaps you could kick off on that one.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I've answered this in several respects already, pointing out the values of it and the meaning of it and the long-term benefit. I think the other thing I would say, apart from what I've said before, is I think it's that you realise you actually belong to this planet. You belong to this earth. It's a fatuous statement in some respects, but rather than you have to have a house, and you've got to have a place and a country and a passport and little human creations, you can actually live on this planet. With the trees and the villages and the whole thing. You're part of it. You're not perching on it. You're part of it. It feeds you. It supports you. You lie down on it at night. You get to understand it, and you feel very much more integrated into the planet. I think before that, my mind was always assuming I live on a map in this particular district, and I get on a road and go to another little zone. But the territory in between the two, I don't really know it. I don't know the land. And this feeling of belonging to it. So I quite expected when we got back to Britain to walk from Heathrow up to Amawaddy. Why not? And sleep out somewhere or other in a ditch somewhere. So that was interesting. Certainly the self-centeredness, the self-will got immensely dented. You have to surrender so many times. Eventually that sense of surrendering to what's happening rather than pushing through it or dismissing it. That sense of opening to the situation was hugely enhanced by that practice and recognition of grace. It's a Christian word, but you can get to those places where walking sometimes days across pretty barren hillscapes, and something will come up that helps you. You know, somebody will turn up in some mysterious junction of a path, and somebody standing there will say, "Oh, you must come to my house." How's that happen? You know, how's that happen? We're walking through the jungle in Nepal, right? We come out of this jungle, we meet this American woman living in a tourist hotel. Hey, you guys, you want to have a Coke? Where does that come from? You know, you're just struggling through the jungle, and there's suddenly an American girl comes out with a Coca-Cola. Who wrote this script? So it's that feeling of, you know, if you live really with integrity and give up a lot, something will come back and support you. And it's not rational, but one has a faith in that.
I remember asking you quite a long time ago, Ajahn, what do you think about grace? And it was the only time I ever got you were stunned into silence. We were driving up to Amravati, and I gave it to you, and then we drove on in silence for quite some time while you thought about it. So yeah, great. Yeah. I think, my personality is one that kind of assumes grace in the world, I think. Very transformational. Extremely so. I really do think that pilgrimage to Kailash, both of them, resulted in significant changes in me. We were, for both of us, people said afterwards we were much nicer beings. They make a point of coming up to us saying, "You're much nicer now." So it did that, but yeah, there was a kind of turning for me from that. It obviously totally humbled by it. So at the time you don't see change, and now I know enough. I understand practice well enough to know that when there's real humility like that, when you're really humbled, it's usually a very good sign. But at the time, I just felt totally humbled and useless, and only looking back do I see the change. But yeah. There was a giving up of a certain kind of level of wanting something out of the world that shifted from that retreat, that pilgrimage. And so from then on, my practice was on a different level. And I don't think I could have found that through lots of meditation retreats. You know, it needed something like that.
Okay, then there's a couple of questions from Sirimedo Bhikkhu, writing from Canada. The first one is for Ajahn Sucitto. What are the most important things you learned about being a samana from being one in India for 6 months? What kinds of new understandings and perspectives did it inspire or really bring home in you about being a samana specifically, being a bhikkhu?
There's a saying that the Buddha said to his first group of disciples. He said, "Walk on tour for the welfare of the many folk, bhikkhus. You should make yourself available. Let yourself be seen in the world." We've become monastic. And in other words, monastic, the one who sticks in a monastery. But that was not the foundation. The foundation was the road, the wanderer. To me, that's always been a much more deeper sense of what this life is about. It's a road. It's not a house. It's not a fixed situation. It's a transit. And that occasion in India really made it very obvious, because one was walking on a road or a dirt track. You're on the move, with not much future. living on the present moment. And that sort of takes you back to the root of what the foundation of the Buddha and his early disciples lived on. And so you really feel like you're much more in touch with the original modalities of the gone forth life. And that it works. That it's not just your own practice, but that, and I found this everywhere, not just in India. I do Tudong walks, I've done them in Tibet, I've done them in England, and the sight of a samana has effects on people, and by and large they're very positive effects, very little negative effect, very little accusation, very little abuse, mostly just a sense of people feel they stop, they're stirred, what's that, they're inspired, and it transcends the culture. You get it in Britain. People have done Tudong in America. You can do Tudong in Australia. You get the same kind of responses. And so this, in India, obviously they're even more attuned to that. The sight of the holy man is not so estranged from them. And they'd immediately recognize it. They don't just see, as the ordinary village people would see, this is the samana, and then there's a certain sense of, do some chanting, and they're really there with it. They put down on their knees. You do some chanting, and they feel blessed, and they feel, blessed by that. When you're actually in that situation, I think the irony was, as I think Nick pointed out, that perception shifted when we actually went to the Buddhist holy places, because then the Buddhist monk was essentially the tourist with lots of money. So the samana was no longer a samana. He wasn't a samana. He was a visiting Buddhist dignitary. And then the perception shifted. But if you live like a samana, people see it. And when people see it, they respond to it. And that's kind of timeless. And in India, very, very near to the surface. So that's the additional piece, I'd say, that made the bhikkhu life much more open road, open territory, open ground, not just in some place.
And then that's Venerable Sirameda asked Nick particularly, what kind of new ways of seeing the actual life of the Buddha and his immediate disciples arose from really being there on the ground?
Oh, there was so much. I mean, the depth of understanding of the teaching that I got from just living that life, and obviously also just my appreciation of what a bhikkhu is, what Ajahn has just been saying, my understanding of, when it comes to supporting a monk or whatever, or a nun, the depth of understanding of what they're about, really, I got a lot from the pilgrimage. And then, yes, that goes on resonating. I read suttas and I picture India, I picture, how we were and what we were doing. So I can really understand, not just the analogies, but the way he's attempting to set up a life, and it really allowed me to understand it so much better. I'd really recommend to anyone serious about Buddhist practice to go on pilgrimage. As Ajahn said, we're both strong characters. There's not many who could do what we did. I'm not recommending you do that. But do something. Do a pilgrimage where you're spending time at the holy places. Don't do the rushing around in a bus business. Take your time. And I went back with a group of people who I teach. I offered to take a group, and we walked into some of the holy places, like me and Ajahn did. We walked into Bodh Gaya. We several of them. I realised, we could just walk for a day. The coach could leave us off there, and we'll walk in. And So because I wanted to share with them the experience and give them some flavour of it, but both men and women, and they were so appreciative of it. But it was really difficult. I should have known. Everyone was pushed to the limit by it. But everyone was wonderful afterwards. So I really recommend anyone who's serious about Buddhist practice, use the holy places in those ways, not just for the tour and the kind of effect of the thing, but to really immerse yourself in India and where the Buddha taught and lived. It's meant a lot to me in my life.
Thank you. There's a question from Eowyn of Massachusetts, USA. What from your journeying might inspire and help your listeners who wish to connect Dhamma with environmental conservation, both in day-to-day practice and in theory? It seems to me that the values involved in each are aligned, and that both go against the stream, around the floods of blind gratification and confused disconnection. Ajahn?
Well, exactly. I think this extends beyond the pilgrimage. This is a deeper or more complete question, but essentially, it's to realize, well, that the environment is not just out there. The environment, we are the environment. Our mind states are part of the environment. The trees are part of the environment. My body's part of the environment. My state of mind is part of the environment. My social attitudes are part of it. They're all knitted together. And Dharma, by works fundamentally on my own mind, but works on my mind in relationship to the physical world, to other human beings, and so forth. So it actually, Dhamma is about the law that unifies the cosmos in its psychological and physical manifestations into something harmonious. And there's the relationship, and it's the duty of the human being to establish the moral compass within that, that sets everything right. With basically the very simple law: you do unto others, you don't do unto others what you wouldn't want them to do to you, and you just keep extending that beyond human beings to other creatures and so forth. Deep respect, non-harming, and integration. Then you feel a sense of harmony. That means you don't get the incredible needs that the isolated human being experiences. If you feel more integrated, it's amazingly satisfying. Some of the happiest, most satisfied times I've experienced have just been sitting by a campfire out in the wilderness. You feel completely happy. You don't have a whole lot of stuff, but there's something about just being really in the environment that is harmonious. So, virtue or non-harming is part of that. The other big part of it is renunciation as a Dhamma practice. And it becomes so staringly obvious these days that we've got to do some big time renunciation because we're living way above the limits of what the planet Earth can provide. And people don't want to hear that, but it's the truth. This Earth cannot provide the material support for the lifestyle that people in Europe and America live by. It cannot provide that. So you've got to do some renouncing. And instead of seeing that as a somewhat miserable experience, if you get a sense of integration into where you're at, it's a happy experience because you're casting off all this clutter and these agitations that get in the way. And so, that's a big part of it. The pilgrimage was a pretty deep end renunciation practice, and I wouldn't expect to live at that standard all the time. But it does remind one that one can live pretty, way below the standard and get by. and even living, one can live more comfortably than that in a renunciant form, and that's very important at this particular time. Yeah, And the other thing is generosity, because as a generosity, people are sharing. People are less needy, less crime, less violence, less jealousy, and probably less children. Children in India are basically your insurance policy to look after you. Well, if we look after each other, you don't need to have 10 kids. You don't need to have 10 kids in case 8 of them die. So we've got to look at how does this population stop mushrooming? Because again, it's just simple arithmetic. You cannot keep having more and more people on the same landmass. So what about renunciation in terms of looking at why is it that we need so much? And if we share, you've got people who have $100 billion of personal wealth. That's more than a country has. Couldn't they share it out a bit? When you look at the statistics where half, I think something like 20 people have got the wealth of half the planet. That's I'm not blaming them. I say something about the system that created that is completely out of whack. So there's got to be sharing and generosity. Otherwise, we're finished on all levels, not just physically but psychologically. We exhaust the earth. We also exhaust our sense of trust, companionship, love, the things that human beings are good at, which is love, morality, and wisdom. If we lose those, we just got a bunch of money, but we're basically dead on a dead planet. The Dharma encourages, renunciation, generosity, and virtue, and kindness. And this is the antidote.
Thank you, Ajahn. Well, Nick, did you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, well, the start of the question, I think, says, what effect did it have on one's attitude to the environment? And that obviously, for me, it had no effect, because having worked in nature conservation for all of my adult life until I did that walk, I knew it all. The sense of seriousness that people are starting to have now. If you're a trained ecologist, ecologists are about understanding systems, how everything affects each other. I was seeing that in the 1980s, and the 1970s, or the early 80s, and leads to a sense of despair. The environment. Everything Ajahn said is right, and that's why I stopped working in nature conservation. That I saw the problem wasn't the birds or the nature; it was the people, and that what the world needed was wisdom. And if I was going to do anything useful, it would be, it would help. That's what I needed to help. And working for 10 years, building the Dharma hall at Chithurst Monastery, getting the management of their woodland sorted out, all of that. The way I helped Chithurst it's like helping a factory that makes wisdom. That's what I see a good monastery, a functioning monastery, as being. It's something that's putting wisdom in the world. So that's what's needed, and people giving the reflections that Ajahn Sucitto just gave. And hopefully the world will start listening, but so far I don't see it. And for my own personal journey has been just one of acceptance. Realising that actually the life on the planet is fine. It's just our habitat that we're destroying. If we ever get the habitat to that point where we can't survive here anymore, life will be fine. Something will survive, even if it's a cockroach and one daisy or whatever, and then over 1 million years life will evolve a whole load of biodiversity again. So yeah, we've got to wake up to this planet. But still, I see a process as happening. There's just when you stand back from it, there's a process. There's the consumption of biodiversity to make cultural diversity. In 1,000 years ago, everyone would feel the same about cutting down a piece of woodland and building a hall there or some building there. They'd see it as an improvement. Now, we're at a situation where some of us think cutting down the rainforest to make more complicated cities, to make iPhones or whatever, isn't worth it. But there's still a hell of a lot of people out there who think iPhones are more important than the Amazon. So there's still a long way to go, And my own personal journey is one of doing what I can to bring wisdom into the world, and when I have an opportunity to do something to protect the environment, there's a few situations where I've been able to do that. I do it, but also accepting it's what's happening, because a lot of people like me working in nature conservation really suffer from this. Have a sense of despair, and I don't have that sense of despair anymore. I've accepted it. This is what's happening in the world.
In order to round off this session, there's a question for each of you from Rose in Boston, USA. So, first of all, for Nick, she asks, in Great Patient One, you conclude that you managed the pilgrimage poorly, but that something somewhere had changed. Do you still feel that way about your handling of the pilgrimage? And can you talk more about those changes?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'll try and put my finger on it. Yes, I still think about it. I look back on it as a very significant point in my own practice and my own view of the world. And I think I'm the theologian. I don't know, put me right about some of these things, but there is a kind of teaching in Mahayana where they, Mahayana Buddhism, where they talk about samsara and nirvana being the same thing, and I think that teaching is trying to point out what happened for me on that pilgrimage. Until my practice until that pilgrimage was very materialistic, in that I was seeking release, seeking something from the world, seeking experiences of wonder or release or whatever you want to call it, or enlightenment seeking, and there was a turning that happened then, that I can only now look back on and see now, is that I was just interested in what was in the way after that pilgrimage. I was interested in how I make suffering for myself and suffering for others. My focus was on that, not on what was there when that was dealt with. Because the mind is content, happy, joyous, etc. when it's not burdened with this conditioning, so I was and I can now see that was the point. It was from that pilgrimage onwards that the way how I was going about practice changed. So from then on, I wasn't seeking from my practice in the same way. So I think that's as good as I can express it. I don't think I've ever said that before, but looking back, that's what happened.
Excellent. And she puts it question for you, Ajahn. So what is your answer? Where are we going? Is the answer different for everyone, or is there perhaps no answer? In the Great Patient One, you offer cryptic phrases like, look, it's like this. and that's the way it is. Just wondering if you can expand on your insights.
Yeah, the phrases are there to invite the reader to contemplate. I'm not saying how it is. On one level, I'm saying it's like this. Life is just like this. It's just moving along the road. People die. You bless them. You move on. Life is like a wave. You're in this wave, and it crashes, and that's it. It's transient, and you keep moving through it. And that, in a way, is what's expressed in the pilgrimage, and in that final statement. This is, if I look back on the whole thing, of all that poignant and frightening and horrifying and funny and confusing time, it's just like ripples on a pond moving through. And rather than personal, my personal story about me and what I want, what I don't get, what I'm going to be, and where I'm going, and I want to be this, I'm going to get to there. This is not a personal story. It's a story that writes a person rather than a person that writes a story. Once you see it that way round. I'm not the writer of this story. The story is life, and it writes me. And you see that, and some of the self-centeredness, the obsessiveness, the doubt, the isolation, the arrogance, the loneliness of the sense of self disappears, because the person is really just a fantasy, a kind of a poignant fantasy, a poignant mirage that life plays. And I was just sort of presenting that, but also just leaving a lot of space for the reader themselves to get to that point where they've listened and read all this and felt what they felt as it went along, as they were moved by it or amused by it or excited by it or shocked by it. They've been through their pilgrimage reading this book. So where are you going? You've been on this walk in some or another. Now look, where are you? And you see, all of your life is just a story playing itself. And that's part of it. There's also, what is it that's able to see that? Once we know the story, in some way something steps out the story. We're the witness to the story, but rather than being the actor within it. And in a way, that's the journey, I would say. One expression of the journey, spiritual journey, is not to get to some new place where I can be, enlightened or happy or whatever. I'm going forward, but no, I'm going deeper beneath the illusion of self. I'm penetrating that. That's what this whole journey, life journey, pilgrimage journey, book journey is about. That's where we're going. And we don't finish the journey until we finish that process. But it's up to the reader to consider for themselves. They've walked with us, now we're on our way. Now it's up to you, reader. What do you think? Where are you going?
Thank you very much, Ajahn, and thank you, Nick. I think the listeners will find that very interesting. Goodbye.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, great questions. Well done, whoever sent them in, or those who sent them in.
And big thanks to Mike, who's helping to edit sound editing together, and thank you for everyone, and Patrick and everybody who's put the podcast together. Personally, it's brought the whole thing back to life again for me. Doing this whole thing, it's brought it back to life, and I continue to contemplate and be enriched by that pilgrimage. So thank you to Nick.
Well, That's the end of the Indian pilgrimage, but it wasn't all that was posted onto the podcast. As you heard in the answers, Nick also recorded the account of his pilgrimage to Mount Kailash with 3 other monks and that of his teacher, Ajahn Sucitto, which was posted as weekly offerings during the last COVID lockdown. The podcast, Where Are You Going?, is still available online. We hope one day to also produce that book, In My Teacher's Footsteps, as another audiobook.